We left on January 6th, and that was in company with Regina. She was going overseas, so we accompanied her to Hawaii during her mission workup period there.
Regina was deploying for Operation Artemis off to the Gulf, and so we were a consort for her during her mission workups that were being conducted en route to Honolulu. So we transited from Esquimalt to Hawaii with her, and then we were then going to stay in Hawaii. There was exercise Koakai, which was an exercise just in the opera areas off of Hawaii with USN.
So we were going to be basically the duty oiler for the U.S. fleet out of Pearl Harbor. It was an opportunity for us to do a lot of razzing and also do some ops with our American counterparts.
And then we were staying to be the Mid-Pacific oiler until about the end of February, early March, I think was the plan, and then back to Esquimalt after that.
Been away for 2 months. We were looking forward to going home and being home for the March break. So, it had been a pretty regular day at sea. So we'd done drills in the morning. We were doing drills that night.
And everything was moving along like clockwork. It was a really good engineering drill. And we were pretty much at the state of full operation with the full power available. We just had to get that last TA up and cut in the last boiler. So all the steam equipment is running, the auxiliary equipment, and the last one to come online was the port TA. So we heard a very loud vibration, almost to the point where you could almost feel it in the MCR. So instantly I just moved the trainee out of the seat and I took over the engineering officer to watch's position, did 6 bells on the Henschel, put the shaft RPM to 0, stopped the shaft immediately with our controls.
His immediate action was to look at the alternator, but at the same time reduce the speed of the shaft, and I called the captain right away to let him know we were having probably an engineering emergency, but that we were hearing noise that we had never heard before.
Right away I thought it was the main turbines or the gearbox or the shaft line, something along there that was causing this very massive vibration. It literally only takes a few seconds from 40 RPM to stop the shaft, which stops all the rotating assemblies. And that noise had not subsided.
I remember looking in that area, and right away I could hear the vibration, and you could start feeling them. And I immediately started to scream, "Shut it down!" But the person he couldn't hear me, so I ran briskly towards the end of where this area of the catwalk was, and I'm still screaming, "Shut it down!" And then I go right at that point where I'm literally 6 feet away from the actual turbo alternator, and the individual itself was maintaining the main throttle valve that was bringing up the turbo alternator. And I remember telling him, "Shut it down," literally like that, "Shut it down." And at that point, he heard me, he turned around, and I'll never forget his look. He had these beady eyes holding the valve. And right at that point, when he looked at me, and I was staring at him, all of a sudden, there was a giant boom. All of a sudden, a giant oil spray hitting the actual top of the deck, which is approximately 12 feet high, and spraying like an umbrella left and right, left further than I could see from where I was, and to the right, again, as far as I could see, essentially hitting the outboard side of the ship.
So while they'd already shut the steam to it, and it was winding its way down in speed. You still have all that oil still pumping out onto the hot bearings and hot turbine. And
there's a bunch of mechanism on the valve, so I'm trying to readjust things to try to get it to shut. And right when I'm doing that, a blanket of fire spread. It hit the top of the deck and spread immediately over very quickly, instantaneously. And as that blanket of fire went over top of us, it surrounded us.
As per normal, every day, the executive officer and myself carry out habitability rounds in the evenings. I guess we were about 2/3 of our way through the habitability rounds when the emergency alarm sounded and reported a fire in the engine room.
And the whole engine room lit up.
At the time, I knew we were doing engineering drills, but the emergency pipe came through right away. And then it was clear that it wasn't a drill.
At least from my perspective in the wardroom, it was almost electric in that moment, because suddenly we went from the usual to this doesn't feel like it's part of the program at all. And people were moving with a purpose. I grabbed my flash gear and went down to sickbay, which is where I went whenever there were action stations.
And I could see the port TA on the top and on the inboard side, a massive fireball.
And then I turned, and Kuntz was there, who was the evaporator watchkeeper, and I remember grabbing him. I just touched him just enough towards the direction of the 2 CO2 bottles, where we had 2 75-pound CO2 bottles, and as soon as I grabbed him, I went to it, he knew exactly what I meant, and he just went straight to activate it while I grabbed the nozzle. And I grabbed the nozzle, and I just, again, got a fire over top of us as we're doing this. And if I was to literally stretch out my hand, I would be in the fire. And it's just amazing to me how quickly Kuntz knew what to do, and the boodle is still shutting that. And I don't know what they did at that point, because I immediately, as soon as I grabbed the nozzle, I turned it on, put it over top of the flames, directed the flames down right away, in a crouched position, especially with the heat, and how quickly everything's intensifying from the smoke, the heat, and the layers of that fire that were over top of us, and I'm just putting it down. And from the position I'm at, I'm just expending it on it, and it looks like it's out at this point, but fully knowing that it may not. So what I did at one point is I eased off just a touch on the actual nozzle. As soon as I eased off, immediately the flame started to come back, and I just went back on, stayed on it, and then I ran out. And that's not a good feeling. And as soon as I ran out, it came again, same thing, and it felt even stronger now.
So they'd expended most of the CO2 on the first time, and then when it lit up the second time, because it's almost coming out as atomized, and that oil is extremely warm at this point. So atomizing it through a smaller hole, and it was all over the deck head, all over the machinery around it. So it just needed an ignition source again, which it found one. And this time the fireball was much larger, much more violent. And they hit it with the CO2 again, but they already used most of it, so they ran it till it was dry, the CO2 system, and not much else they could do.
I turned around. I wanted to see where the other guys were. I went towards them immediately, and I saw them both getting dressed with the 2 SCBAs that we have in the space, which is our breathing apparatus. So they were both getting dressed. I immediately went to them, and I'm like, there's nothing else we can do. Get out of here. So then I went from the point where I was at, and that was right on the actual, by the main engine gearbox. At that point, I went straight for the hydraulic door. And to me, it was the lowest door, closest door, safest door to go through from where we're at. Because from where the fire was, the after engine room door was directly above that fire, in the midst of the thermals and actually the initial flames that were rolling off of the top of the deck were rolling in that area. Went through opened the hydraulic door, turned around, Boozled and Kuntz weren't behind me. Because my immediate thought was they would have just prepared the SCBAs, taken them with them, and followed me. And they didn't. That was scary.
So the XO's role is to lead rapid response anytime there's a fire or a flood as an emergency. For an engineering space, the response of that team is to muster in the machinery control room, the MCR. What was beneficial in this respect was the marine systems engineering officer was in the MCR. So she was able to give me the quick sit rep on what had happened, what was going on, what the assessment was.
Within about a minute, there was already smoke ingressing the MCR. As soon as I saw that, I directed the team to grab the SCBAs, our breathing apparatus, which unfortunately we only have 3 available. Chief Yari and I went without a breathing apparatus, so that the 3 people that are actually on watch or operators could have their breathing apparatus on.
So there's a time where we were buddy breathing, like me and EO were, and the Chief Penner and I think Pedestrian McInnes were both buddy breathing at that point. So, but after we got some SCBAs down there and some bottles, we, took a step back. I was making sure my boilers didn't flame out, more or less, make sure they were running. But eventually we blacked out anyways, so I was just a runner at that point. And then I reported back to the after LCO again and just stood there and asked them what they needed to do. And it turned out that they needed somebody as a on-scene commander.
In less than a minute, I have a big window that I get to see the whole plant from my machinery control room. It was pure black.
As I'm opening the door, they're not behind me. They have SCBAs. They must think they can get out through a different way and be breathing. They're in a better state than I am. I'm going to trust they know what they're doing. But just the same, they didn't follow me. Immediately, I knew I had to inform the MCR. So I just remember just from there, running up the uptakes as quickly as I could. I get out of the uptake door, and we're talking about climbing up 1, 2, 3, 4 flights of stairs, exiting that uptake door. And as soon as I exit the door, that's where the after section base, which is our damage control team for the after house, was getting ready. And basically, I just went straight down to the MCR at this point. And I remember the executive officer was there. First thing I said to him, sir, there's a fire portier. I just used the 2 CO2 bottles. And I just remember him saying, I know, it's too smoky here. You need to get out. And it was very, very smoke. It was a very thick gray smoke. I could hear people screaming. One person screaming, I can't breathe. I could see the legs of people on the bottom, just hazy enough where I could see somebody on the electrician's panel. I could see somebody engineering our watch panel. I could see 2 open boxes of SCBAs. And I could just hear people that were trying to communicate to get things done. And at that point, I'm like, I just blindly just said, fire portier, both CO2 bottles were used. Have you guys seen Bujold and Kuntz?
You're in the moment, you're dealing with something really large that was thrown at you. And all of a sudden, it just puts a real lead weight in your gut when you find out one of your members might still be in that space.
I only had seen Petty Officer Aubrey, who came up to give a report, but also another member that lost his way in the engine room and came out through a door that leads into the MCR and basically collapsed.
Yeah, he was one of the guys in the engine room, and he was just engulfed in smoke. This is one of those pictures that I always have in the back of my mind, because when he opened the door, he was just amazed to be coming out of that space, and the look of despair on his face, it was incredible.
And once I was on air, it dawned on me to say, holy moly, where's everybody else that was in there?
My priority initially was that we need to find an account for people.
Who's down there? Who can't breathe? Who needs help getting out? And so when we had a quicko group between the corporal and myself, the leader for the RAT, it was, here's what I want, this is what I want, in terms of getting in there and making sure the space is clear to personnel.
I wasn't concerned with getting water on a fire. I was concerned with accounting for people in the initial thing. because it's a pretty sinking feeling when you realize there is a fire and there's people down there and it's chaotic and you can't really necessarily know where everybody is because everybody's trying to close up. While people are closing up, we were starting to lose spaces because of smoke. So it was much more chaotic than, we see in sea training exercises and things like that.
I remember at one point when I was in the after section base, I asked them, did you guys find Bujold and Kuntz? And they're like, yes, Bujold's in sick bay right now and Kuntz is accounted for. And it was like, okay. And then I found out later that that Bujold went straight up into the thermal layer. Something happened with his mask or his SCBA, and it was faulty. So he ended up right in the forward MCR door, banging on the door to get in. Bujold essentially, of his own strength, came in, basically staggered in, now obviously, from my understanding, dizzy and disoriented from the smoke, and sort of flopped into the EO's arms, still able to have enough strength to walk, and she basically just grabbed him and took him by the MCR door to the after section base and just handed him off, and then they took him to the sick bay. And that in itself is pretty interesting because Bujold's about 6'3", 250 pounds, and the MSCO, she is about 5'2", 110 pounds soaking wet.
We do all this training, now we need to actually carry through and we need to deal with it. And it's one thing to put people into a space that's got fake smoke in it. It's another thing to get people to go into a space that's actually on fire. The way people react in an emergency varies from the very, surprisingly outstanding to some people will have difficulty being able to do their jobs. And that's no different whether in the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, I'm pretty sure any other profession, when you put people under that much stress.
I went back to the MCR, and as soon as I went in, I went right into the smoke, right up to the engineering officer to watch, and I says, Chief Engineer, and he came a foot away from me, finally, that I could just see his mask. And so I said, it's Aubrey, what do you guys need? And he just said, we need to get the diesel up right now.
It's not a modern ship. It's not like a CPF where, if you have a fire in a gas turbine on a frigate, there's a whole bunch of systems that we can put that fire in. The gas turbines are in an enclosure. Like you can fire off fine water spray, which puts out the fire only within that compartment. You can put halon into there. There's a whole bunch of things that you can do in there. Whereas on my ship, the fitted system is an overhead sprinkler system, AFFF, that floods the entire engine room.
It wasn't a simple, okay, rapid response didn't put it out, activate the fitted system. There was two big things that went into that decision. The size of the space, remembering we're talking probably the size of a small school's gym. Do we want to flood it with water and foam? Yes, in terms of putting out fires, but what's the impact on equipment? And I'm walking at that point under the impression that dousing that whole space leaves us dead in the water, a couple of days sail off of Hawaii with no one readily available to help if we need help. During training at the damage control school, being spoken to about the inversion, steam inversion, where if you put too much water into a space that's full of that level of heat, you can actually end up cooking people. That's what's in my head. So that's both reasons, damage to equipment and damage to people, that are keeping that decision to use a fitted system from really entering into my equation at the time.
We knew very quickly that we were going to lose power. The Chief ERA directed one of the engineers to go down and lock the shaft with turning gear. But unfortunately, I think the first 2 times he tried, he couldn't get to it just due to the heat and the intensity of the fire.
Less than 30 minutes, somewhere around 30 minutes, I think, where we lost all our power. For me as XO, my experience is both the ShinCom and general broadcast are critical, because a ship that big, making sure everyone has the communication that we need is critical to being effective. And I had already seen where the general broadcast is a significant force multiplier in making sure everyone's working off the same information, fixing errors in information, and making sure people are aware what's going on. They may be a part of Section Base 4, which is a manning pool. They might be there with no idea what's going on because no one's talking to them at all. But at least every now and then, they've got a pipe that gives them a sit rep on what's happening so that they know and they can be mentally ready for whatever would be coming.
So I went inside, immediately grabbed Chief Delisle, and I said, I'm after Section Base IC, I need to know what's going on right now. So he showed me the board, he showed me where they were at on the board, and they were attacking the fire from the after engine room door. And I immediately, as soon as I heard that, and I said, what are your attack routes, where are you going? I said, okay, we gotta stop that right away. I'm not sending anybody else to the after section base door. We need to go through the boiler room hydraulic door right now because it's the height, we have no power. I'm gonna have to manually open the hydraulic door. I'm gonna set up some people to do that. Prior to that, I'm gonna send teams down there to set up all hoses so that they have hoses on the standby, and as soon as we open that door, they can start attacking directly as low as possible and as direct as possible onto that TA. And he goes, absolutely.
We had dispatched to go into the fire through the uptake on the starboard side. We had to go down ladders, which at this point, as soon as we got into the space, you could not even see the ladders. The smoke was coming out of the engine room through into the boiler room and exiting the way we're going in. You were feeling your way around. To get down there, it was one section of the ladder that's very, very tight. With a bottle of air on your back, you are pretty much rubbing your face against the ladder rungs to get down. Once we get down to the very bottom of the boiler room, that's where we found our hoses, the mess of hoses that was actually down there, because there's about 4 hoses that were laid out and they're starting almost all intertwined. And we found the end of our hose and we proceeded into the engine room. And we may have made it 6 to 8 feet, and then our hose got stuck on something. At this point, it was so smoky, the only person who really could see anything was the attack team leader, because he had a thermal imaging camera. And we spent, it felt like about 10 minutes down there trying to get our hose unraveled and so on and so forth. We would check our air, and to do that, you just pull the gauge up to your mask. Well, it was so smoky there, you couldn't actually see it. Shortly after we got the hose entangled, I actually heard one of the guys, he broke the seal on his mask, and he got a mouthful of smoke. And then you could hear him, he's getting a bit panicky. And so we backed out, got to him, make sure he was breathing fine. And he was already in the stage of panic. He used to get me out of the space. So we were like, all right, we had to put down the hose, abandon our attack plan, and get him out of the space. So we got him out, brought him back to the after LCO and to the jungle deck, where he'd get his gear off, get some fresh air into him, get checked over by medical staff. So our first adventure into the fire, and not very effective.
A lot of smoke, a lot of scared people, and a lot of frustration too. There was a lot of frustration. I remember one person in particular, one attack team in particular, they had a young girl, she was the nozzleman. And I remember that she, as soon as the door opened, she dropped the nozzle and freaked out, and she ran up the port side boiler room. And then one of the other same attack team, he ran up to try and get her. So you're left there with the attack team leader and the nozzleman. And I just said, just return back. Make sure those guys get back to the base okay.
We were in a dire situation that we had no power, that we were fighting a huge fire. So I was dealing with that external thing, calling back and saying, you know, hey, I need some help here. Who do I get help from? Who do I need to call? How do I call them? All those things I didn't ever think I would be on a sat phone on a bridge wing, you know, with smoke billowing out of my ship, calling my boss, you know, the Commodore, and saying, sir, I'm in a bit of a world of hurt here.
Now I had to have a team of people that knew how to open up this hydraulic door setup. So I'm in there and I'm saying, I'm grabbing people, and I said, this is what I need right now. I need a team set up right away. I want people that know where they're going, that know these spaces inside out, and know exactly what I want them to do, because it's going to be more than just damage control now. I need technically, and then spatially, to know these and be so familiar that you're blindfolded. So I informed member HQ1 and told them, I need engineers strictly as attack team leaders. Initially, my initial what was I need Cert 2s and above.
The damage control organization, the normal damage control organization, which has section-based teams, wasn't going to work. That we needed to go to a sustained posture where we put everybody in one spot, and I got a lot more attack teams, a lot more flexibility in dealing with this situation. So that was the next sort of milestone, was where XO and I talked and said we need to go to a sustained event, meaning we're not going to put the fire out right away.
As things progress now and we relocated ourselves, when we relocated at this point, we were in a sustained fire condition. So everything had to go. There's too many people here. There's too much stuff. I only need a certain amount of people, and Manning Pool has to arrange all this. So perfect. We're relocating to the other side. All non-essential equipment, bring it to Manning Pool. TAC teams currently here with the spare bodies for the equipment that's essential, stay here. Everyone else, Manning Pool. Relocated to the other side, and from that point on, to me, it was just very smooth.
So when you walked out from the forward house into the dispersal area, that was the first sort of shock to the system, because it was people crying and the occasional, not screaming, but there were people who were clearly scared.
The command team and up in the ops room was quiet, but some of the radio traffic, you could hear the fear and stuff over the radio as the attack team leaders were taking these teams in. You know, the announcements of different casualties going down, and most of it was just mostly heat exhaustion.
I remember when I first got out of that HQ1, somebody coming out from the after engine room and just screaming and tearing their mask off and tossing it down. And then not long after that, a person behind him came out and collapsed. And just seeing that and seeing people are reacting, and it's just about, okay, grab that person, casualty clears, grab them immediately, bring them to sickbay, undress them. We have a job to do, take care of them, but move on. We need to keep going here.
They had a really good setup with all of the people lined up, transferring equipment, so how the rotation worked for when an attack team came out, got stripped down, got the equipment moved over, got them taken care of by medical staff, and then the next group of people that were getting dressed and ready to go.
I was calling to find out how I could get a ready-duty ship out of Pearl Harbor. And the Commodore, when I called him, he was in his truck on the way into the base because he'd already been called by the watchkeepers and said to him that, you know, that we were in a bit of a fight, and that I knew that any sort of smoke casualties or any sort of casualties that we probably didn't have the resources to be able to deal with them.
As the evening progresses, I continually make rounds down to the dispersal area where we consolidate this full team event. Make sure I check in with the doctor, check in with the OPIs for the different stations to make sure that everything that they needed was getting to them. And if not, then usually I will be running around filling those gaps to make sure if some kind of communication had been dropped somewhere, or a piece of equipment that was supposed to get somewhere didn't get there, then I'm the guy pushing that in the background. And constantly I run from the command station back and forth to the areas of the ship to make sure that there's no holes.
In a big fire like that with a lot of boundaries, attack teams don't last very long because it's 400, 500 degrees. So we were going through a lot of bottles, breathing bottles, and because we lost all our power and we couldn't get emergency power up, we were using a portable compressor, 2 portable compressors to fill the bottles. They take 20 minutes to fill a bottle. When you're going through bottles the way we were going through them, it became evident to me, you know, when I asked how many bottles we had left, they started counting. You know, at one point we were at 40 bottles, and it wasn't long when I looked at the count, we were 9 bottles left. So we were losing the battle with breathing bottles.
People would be coming in, and every single person that would be coming in would be giving me their briefs. I knew their briefs. I would be the person briefing them, and I would see if they were able or not. And there were moments when I would say, "Where are you going?" And the person didn't know. And I had to say, "Go back to Manning Pool and tell them your name." And that would we need another person to go back in. You're going down attack route, starboard uptake, straight down, go port side. You have a hose waiting for you and an on-scene commander. On-scene commander will tell you a brief on where the exact location of the fire team is. Once you get to that fire team, I need you to immediately contact back to let us know that you've been established. And at this point, because our communications were being lost, We had no PRCs in between the fire. I had to establish a fifth person on the attack team as a runner, basically hauling their hoses. And as soon as they were set and they were advancing in the fire, to immediately contact the on-scene commander and come back to us, or act as a runner in between the spaces to establish that communication. So I established every possible way of communicating, from the on-scene commander to the PRCs to the runners, so that we would have some type of flow of information, because it was extremely difficult to get anything. Because a lot of times they would come back in the beginning and they wouldn't give us a full picture. It's like, we're advancing in the fire. I'm like, I know you're advancing in the fire. Where? And how big? How small? What's the state around you? So I can inform the HQ1 immediately.
We're only in about 4 feet, and that's where the evaporators are. And even without the tick camera, you could see the glow of the red and the bulkhead. That's the ceiling. It kind of looked like one of those, those dark, cloudy days, and the sun just kind of pokes through the clouds. That's exactly what it looked like. I looked at it. I took the camera, looked at it. Yeah, I showed my nozzle man, this is where we're going. I told him to on water. Let's get this out. So he kept the water on until I told him to shut the water off. Looked at it. It was completely out. Looked good. Then we just continued to progress aft in the boat to where the original part of the fire was, which is over the turbo alternator, the TA. Yeah. We got there, and it was the same thing. You see a nice red glow. So I told him, same thing, put the water on. And we were down there for probably about 20 minutes. We got the fire out over the TA. My backup, he informed us, he yelled forward. He's like, hey, the fire reflashed above the evaporators. So it's my decision. I told him, I said, pull the hose back, you're going to put it out. This is also the same guy that panicked the first time we went in. He had equipment malfunction. So he was actually kind of mad at himself for that. And he got water on the fire. So for me, I wanted to make sure he was feeling like he was part of the team, and he was.
There were many fires in various areas, from the top of the mezzanine, in between the VAPs, from the joy control area to the TA, and there was lagging fire also in certain areas in between some of the piping. So you're getting excited when you say fire's out, and then we want to start conducting an overhaul. And as you're starting to conduct these overhauls, all of a sudden fire's back on in a different area. And that's very hard, I could only imagine, for command, trying to make a decision on what's the next steps. I talked to Chief Delisle, and immediately said to him, he says, have you guys considered AFFF? And he immediately just told me, he says, the CO, Chief Engineer, EO, and they're having all the big meeting on the quarterdeck right now. And I'm like, perfect, that's all I needed to know.
The MCR was untenable because of the smoke. HQ1 both had smoke and it had melted decks because the heat coming up was so significant.
The heat was something I had never felt before. My boots were melting on the deck.
We were not in a great position with respect to fire main water for the fire, because we had one fire pump that was operational at that point, a diesel fire pump that was working. The second one we couldn't get up, and no one could tell me how much fuel we had left in it. So they were trying, to figure out how much fuel we had left in that. We were trying to make the plant safe, turning gear in. We didn't want to turn the shaft. We knew we had no lube oil to our gearbox. So there's a whole bunch of engineering things going on, a whole bunch of things with the fire. And then, it became evident, though we thought we were ahead of the fire, when we finally got another TAC team. After 2 reports the fire was out, we sent a TAC team in, and the TAC team, it was obvious that the fire was spreading. So we released AFFF. That extinguished the main blaze, I would say. It put out the majority of the fire, and then it took us another, I think, 8 or 9 attack teams to put out the fire, all the hot spots that were in there, because it spread through the wireways.
Smoke billowed out into countless mess decks, because that's right below all the mess decks. So we had 150 people that no longer had a place to sleep or any of their personal belongings except what they were wearing. At that point, everyone's tired. You had people wearing the firefighting gear, sleeping on a steel deck. Luckily, it was Hawaii and not somewhere further north.
Some of the first images I shot were, and that I remember vividly, is going out on the waste decks. And they had some gym mats laid out, and it was just rows and rows of these sailors in bunker gear sleeping.
People naturally found through their own workspaces in other parts of the ship places to put themselves and establish where they lived. Makeshift hammocks and makeshift bunks. And it was probably surprising how little direction was needed on that and how people just made it work.
I think it was around 5 in the morning. A lot of us were ordered to go have a nap.
And after that, the next morning, we needed to do somewhat of an assessment.
So we need to start to move on to that next phase. Is that, okay, we're not in the dire situation we were 12 hours before where we were literally fighting for the ship, but now we got to figure out, okay, how can we start to regain parts of the ship? How can I get power back? How can I get black water back? And how can I feed people? And so it took a lot of folks and a lot of effort to sort of move down that road of being able to regain function on the ship.
There was still obviously a lot of optimism in the air that, oh, maybe we can sail back by ourselves. Unfortunately, I was the bearer of bad news to say it's not going to happen. We had produced a list, the Chief ERA and I think out of our 70 systems, 50 of them were inop or completely destroyed.
One of the next big hurdles is how do we get a generator? We have one emergency generator that's up forward away from the fire, but there's no resistor. The senior electrician knew that washing machines or dryers have parts that can help build it, so he had his electricians doing that. At the same time, and independently, I had the combat systems engineering officer come to me holding a toaster from the wardroom pantry and asking if I was all right if he destroyed the toaster. He's got a tech that he thinks can turn parts in the toaster into a 1 ohm resistor. So watching a leading seaman on the deck with pen scratches on some cardboard, his winger holding a flashlight so he can see it, taking apart a toaster and building components into a resistor to go into a 500, 750 kilowatt generator, is kind of impressive. And they did make it work. They were able to bring it back online, not without some extra interest with what was potentially a reflashed fire in the engine room. But when you have 297 people on board and no power, I kind of completely and utterly agree with the CO's decision to attempt to reflash that. Because otherwise we would have had nothing.
The electricians worked extremely hard and managed to restore emergency power, which provided power to, most of the essential things. So some toilets. The hall techs did amazingly. They set up saltwater showers, which was very welcomed after a few days. We restored emergency lighting and the compressed air. We were basically gearing on how can we fight the next emergency? What is the minimum requirement that we need now? So that was our primary focus, as well as making sure that our fire pumps were working, because that was the only piece of equipment that we had that worked that night.
We learned things with the Chicoutimi fires, that smoke inhalation. We had a lot of people that breathed in smoke. A lot of us, all of us, had breathed in a fair amount of smoke, and some people more. So that requirement to check, every 12 hours, everybody had to be checked by the medical staff. Everybody had to get their O2 levels taken and all that sort of stuff. So
the sorts of casualties were very consistent with what we would expect. Some smoke inhalation, heat stress, and dehydration. And we saw a few other minor physical injuries that would be expected when a busy evolution is taking place.
Stress casualties as well, right? And people that had difficulty with the situation. When you're in a fight like that, everyone is doing everything they can and they forget about everything else in their life other than the fact that they're going to get on with the damage control and they're going to do this. But when you come out the other end of that, so the ship is not going to sink at this point, the fire is out, there's a realization that we're not going to be home in 5 days. There's a whole bunch of other realization that goes in keeping people motivated and,
And having a doctor on board, a padre on board, that whole team that you would normally call in, they assisted us in making sure that everybody was talking about what just occurred. They were looking for people who were showing signs of stress or things like that, so we could deal with that right away. And having everybody then in the one area, it wasn't just the padre or the doctor or the senior personnel looking for that. Even the juniors guys would say, you know, I think that guy's not feeling right. Maybe, Coxswain, you should have the padre come talk to this guy.
Probably one of the most interesting things I saw happen was there was a particular individual. He hadn't been as successful in some of his tasks, completing some of his training. It was a rough go for him. Was not always treated with as much kindness by his colleagues as maybe he should have been. But he excelled on the night of the fire. Kept going back in, kept going back in. When others whom we might have expected to have that attitude weren't in that position. They weren't capable of doing that. And he was viewed by his peers to have been a real hero. And in the days that followed, you could see the change in how others viewed him. There were others for whom it had the opposite effect. People who had a particular image of themselves, people who excelled in a very technical way, but who maybe didn't perform in the way they had hoped they would under those sorts of conditions. And they were very disappointed in themselves. And they were worried that they were now diminished in the eyes of their chain of command, of their peers, of the organization. And yet, even for those individuals, they were still held by the community.
We did everything to make it seem as though it was normal. So we literally had 3 of the people on the PERMON, the Personnel Evaluation Report Monitoring Committee. They were down in the dispersal area, which became the ship's living room. And they had camping chairs and a folding table, and they had stacks of PERs in front of them, and they went through PERs to move it forward.
Because we had such limitations on where the crew could go on the ship, we found that everybody kind of conjugated into one area, that dispersal area, where we were serving food, handing out water, juice, everything that we could bring into the fridges, and of course what the supporting ships were dropping off to us, that we found that everybody was kind of sitting around a kitchen table, if you like.
Is that dispersal area was worth its weight in gold for a place for people to socialize, to eat meals, and to have a bit of a time to relax. We had people, musicians on board that brought up their kit that hadn't been damaged.
So you were finding that the morale was staying up because everybody knew, A, nobody was seriously injured, B, we're all together, we're still a team, and in fact, I think the morale was higher because of that camaraderie. When you've experienced something that nobody else has in their past, it just ups that level of rapport a little more, and everybody was genuinely concerned about the welfare and morale of everybody. So everybody was trying extra hard, and I think that, you know, is a testament, one, to the resilience of not only our crew, all sailors in general, and I think that would occur on any ship, you know.
The whole attitude was just amazing, considering the situation and people just pretty much sleeping wherever they could find a spot to sleep at night. The morale was really high.
From what I've gathered, and I saw in that, obviously due to our abnormal state, most people did not understand, I believe, the gravity of the ship's condition, the state, and what had just happened.
We all thought that it would end the day we passed the line to the other ship to tow us. But then we rapidly found out that every day we had another challenge to meet, sometimes 2 or 3.
We stopped calling them problems. We started calling them Protector challenges, because it did seem like one step forward, you know, and a couple of steps back. 3 or 4 days after the fire was, you know, was a tough day, you know, and when I talked to people about my time in command, it was by far the toughest day I had in command. It was much tougher than the fire, you know. But that morning, the tow line snapped at like 5:30 in the morning. We had a casualty on board. One of my young sailors started off as a Pry 2 and quickly regressed to a Pry 1. very serious casualty. The response was outstanding from, our American counterparts, USS Chosen, and their helicopter was doing some transferring supplies to us, and I told them that I had a casualty, a Pry 2, and they were making arrangements to come and pick her up. Within 5 minutes of me saying it was a Pry 1, they were over my deck. We were outside the range of the helicopter to get to Tripoli, but we're right on the limits, on the wrong side of the limits for that helicopter, and the helicopter picked her up and flew her in there. And then later that day, early that evening, I had a reflash of the fire in the engine room. Between a toe break and a casualty and then a reflash of the fire, it was like, oh, come on, give us a break. We chatted, myself, the Cox, and the XO chatted, and we kind of said, well, if that's the worst day we have, well, then everything can only be better. And it was, and I think that sort of, in the ship's company, we got under tow the next day from the Salvor, and so things were better. So, it was much better after that point. Getting the ship's company focused on getting things back to normal on the ship, getting the ship back to Pearl Harbor, but some of the more senior folks trying to figure out, once we get there, now we need to have a plan when we get there. I needed some sort of form of decompression. We put them under enormous stress, and I wanted to make sure that we took care of people in that first 24, 48 hours. And
Pearl Harbor, on arrival, you now are dealing with essentially a mass casualty situation, but it's not an explosion, it's not a fire, it's emotional.
When you go through something so big with people that have lost their home, because that's how they saw Protector, my biggest concern was their mental health. How are they going to react after? So I was trying to spend as much time as the situation gave me, to listen to everything that they had to say, because making sure they were okay is something that will last forever.
We wanted to keep everybody together. Instead of being displaced in 2 or 3 or 4 different hotels or quarters on the base in Pearl Harbor, you were able to also watch for the signs of, is that stressors continuing? Or is there someone that needs help? Are we getting this person the help he needs? And by having everybody there still talking about this event is a part of the process for when you've gone through what they call a critical stress incident. It's a part of that process is to keep everybody together.
The USN went out of their way and took a barge, an accommodation barge that had been in refit, and got it ready for us over the course of a weekend. And that meant that we could house everybody right next to the ship that we were still responsible for.
Commander Harrigan came over with his band of merry men and women, as I called them. They came over so that when we pulled in, that I could basically get my entire ship's company off, other than a small duty watch component. There was a bunch of people from FMF and engineers that were coming to sort of make the ship safe alongside, so that I could just get everybody off and sort of do that decompression piece, which was, we basically, the first night we went to a little park that was just down the road from the barge and had, beer and pizza.
Confined it to an area where we could manage the tempo of the people, make sure that nobody was putting themselves in the harm's way. And that was the initial thing that I was really concerned about.
And not everybody has civilian attire, because, a lot of people lost everything they owned. So said, we're going to wear uniforms until we can get money advanced to people so they can go buy, the new uniform, which is flip-flops, board shorts, and a T-shirt. Until we can get everybody into that, we're going to wear uniforms. So basically said, I need you guys to buy into this, that we're gonna have leave expire every night at 23:59. We're all going to be on the barge, and for the first 24 or 72 hours, we're going to wear uniforms, and we're going to do this mental health screening. We're going to do all this sort of stuff. And I said, if it just helps one person, the fact that I had to make all of you be on the barge by 23:59, then it's worth it to me, and it should be worth it to you. And there was no resistance to it, none.
Once we came alongside, they then had to start to reintegrate into the real world. They started to communicate more readily with their families, and they sought an opportunity to decompress. But those opportunities were somewhat limited because we still had to maintain a duty watch and there were activities to be carried out.
Once I managed to bunk everybody and get it all worked out, because I still had to track them as if I would on a ship in case we lost someone downtown who went out somewhere. And then, of course, we're still maintaining a ship with a duty watch. I had created a duty watch on the barge. And of course, all this happens in a 3-hour period to get everything as routine as possible, because any sailor, as you know, responds well to routine.
It was very busy that first 48 to 72 hours, dealing with people that, you know, issues from the fire, and people have lives. You know, when you tell sailors they're going to be home on a certain date and they're going to be home for March break and all that sort of live, that stuff carries on, and it causes a lot of stress for some folks. And
people had marriages they were going back for. People had vacations they planned. So then you create a priority list. Who do I need to send home first over the next few months?
You know, whether it was for family issues or because of stress issues that were as a result of the fire. So that consumed a lot of time,
Really, the first week that we were alongside in Pearl Harbor, I mean, they were 18-plus hour days dealing with the family situations. The XO and the CO and the coxswain took enormous pains to try to make sure that those who desperately needed to go back were on that plane as soon as we got back to Pearl Harbor.
Kind of felt like that crisis response piece before we got our feet under us and got into a rhythm, which allowed us to then go, okay, the next group of people is going home at this date. Who needs to go? And who do we want to go because we've got everything tracking in the right direction. We don't need them to be here anymore so they can go home.
Anybody that wanted to go home could go home, that I would get them home, and I would keep 130 people that knew that we were going to stay. And so those people that stayed, they wanted to be there. Myself and the XO and the coxswain saw every single person that flew home. So it was like a nightly thing for us, because the flights are always at night there. It's like at 1800, nearly every single night, me and the coxswain and the XO would say goodbye to people, and I would talk to them just to acknowledge, you know, what they had gone through in the fire. I saw how courageous they were. I saw their teamwork, determination to fight for their ship. And I was the one that got to assess what victory was. And in my mind is that we didn't lose anybody and no one was seriously injured. So that was a victory.
And we'd work with MARPAC headquarters so that there was someone to greet them when they got back, because that was something we deemed that was important.
Every day there was probably, you know, on average 40, 50 challenges that you had to overcome that had nothing to do with the plan of getting the ship ready to be towed back.
Now, how do you get it back to Esquimalt? What do you need to take off of it? Do we want to take the propeller off before you tow it all the way across the Pacific? You got to take the crypto off because you're not putting people on board. Who's going to be on board? Do we need Royal Canadian Navy sailors on board the towing vessel? Is there a security detail? We got to take the small arms off. What about the ammunition? How long would it take to pump 8 million liters of fuel out of there? And when are you saying you want this towed again? There's a huge amount of staff work in terms of how to do that. And then the technical piece on how do you do the tow? What's the towing bridle? Who's bringing it? What are the timelines? What's the weather? What is there weather limitations that we need to be aware of? So it was a huge amount of planning in terms of how is it set up.
My role, along with the remainder of the medical team, was to continue to be responsive to the medical needs of the ship's company. We were fortunate to have support in the form of 2 mental health clinicians and a medical officer and a healthcare administrator who had come from Esquimalt, and they were superbly helpful. But it's important to recognize that being a familiar face to the ship's company, on my part, on that of my team, was crucial to allowing people to feel comfortable to open up to us. It became readily apparent that the need was very high. A lot of people were struggling.
We've got 280 people. What do we keep them doing so that it's not finding things to get in trouble? We got sent a PSP staff, and I mentally didn't know any better, so I'm thinking it's a fitness instructor. So the person arrives, and I start talking to him about all the great fitness incentive or initiatives they can do, and he looks at me and says, "I'm not a fitness instructor. I'm an activity coordinator." And in my head, I'm thinking, I have no idea what that is. I'm pretty sure you're useless to me. But okay. He had a small office, and he started posting all these different things. Here's activities. You can get camping gear from the Morale and Welfare Services here. There's this concert that's coming, you could get tickets this way. There's these events and these tours. I'm going to do a snorkeling activity here, it's only this much money. Gave people something to figure out how to have a weekend, how to have a night, and I started to see larger and larger numbers of people over looking at what he was posting up there and what he was providing the crew. He became, in my opinion, a huge benefit to the ship. Just because you don't understand something at the very beginning doesn't mean it won't be helpful.
What stands out is when you get to a ship, and anybody that's sailed will understand this, they get to a ship, you're part of your department. It was segregated in their own way, but you still knew you were a family, you were a team. As soon as that fire broke out, everybody was your best friend, your brother, and you fought for the guy beside you. It was amazing how fast everybody came together, and no matter what you needed, someone was going to find a way to get it to you.
It was amazing to see a group of people, a ship's company, a unit, come together the way I had seen with a combat arms unit, because they had faced not just adversity, but they had faced death, and they had continued, and they fought, and that's a remarkable experience to not only to share with folks, but I consider myself very privileged to be able to witness that transformation of this particular community of people.
Just how the people responded and how people were just really stepped up. And like everything, I gotta be honest with you, some people didn't. And that's just the reality. People that were panicking, you just gotta put your hand on their shoulder and say, good job. And just encourage them and still go from there. And trying to maintain that composure, that confidence to instill to the guys.
At the end of the day, I've never been so proud of a bunch of people who really gave their everything day in, day out, and they never griped. They were not complaining. They knew the situation we're in, and they did exactly what good sailors would do when they're put into an emergency situation.
The whole command team, they were so calm through the whole situation. That was really amazing to see that calm, cool collectedness in a time of high stress and the risk of losing a ship, right?
There's two things I don't think I ever understood going into command development, going into command boards, and going into tours as XO and to some extent CO. Briefings aren't just there because sea training or someone said you had to do them. They're there because you have to make sure when you're in the command position that you've thought through the risks to people and you have a way of achieving missions that minimizes risk to people and equipment. You really have to pay attention to what you're demanding from people, what you're training people to do. You're dealing with, the tragedies in the lives of 250 plus people. And that's from, the tragedy of people's children being in accident, their spouses being diagnosed with terminal illness, their parents passing on. You don't realize it as you're dealing with it a bit, but at some point it does go and affect you. And if that doesn't have a cumulative effect on you in some way, you're probably not as human as you might want to be. And make sure that you're paying attention to it. Or otherwise you can either become callous and completely ignorant of humanity, and it's all about going to sea and doing what's at sea and ignoring actual life.
That was the most challenging thing that I faced in my career, and I'm absolutely certain it was probably the most challenging thing most of my ship's company had ever faced. Did it actually go perfect? Absolutely not. And I keep telling people is that it's a fool that thinks at any time, whether it's in a fire or a firefight or any of those things, that things go perfect. They don't go perfect. Where you prove yourself is when things don't go perfect and where you don't have all the sort of things you expected to have when you got into these fights or these battles. But folks step up and they do their best and they show unbelievable courage and they work together and they've come together as a team and they fight hard and they come out on the other end where you want them to come out, where they put the fire out, no one dies and no one gets seriously hurt. Because to me, had we lost anybody or we'd seriously hurt anybody, which there was a lot of potential for, given that fire, that would have been the thing that kept with us for the rest of our lives. We're blessed that it's not that. It's that we can look back on it and go, hey, remember on the 27th of February when we had that fire and we got through it. and we got through the next 7 days, and we got the ship back, you know, to Canada.